The second Russia-Africa Summit was held at the Expo Forum in St. Petersburg on 27 and 28 July 2023, after getting postponed from its earlier schedule of October 2022 due to ongoing Ukraine war crisis. This was the second edition of the summit after its first edition held in 2019. However, this year's summit attracted less than half head of African states that attended in the first edition. Representatives of 49 countries, including 17 heads of state, attended the summit in the Russian city. This low attendance of African head of states is being lauded by the US, which it sees as Kremlin's diplomatic failure and isolation. However, Russia accused the United States and its Western allies of putting unprecedented pressure on African countries to derail the summit. Russia went on to say that the upbeat mood during the meeting between President Vladimir Putin and tens of Africa's presidents and heads of state was a strong statement that Africa and Russia are two partners which are not letting go, despite the West's negativity about their differences. Although there might be some truth in Russia's accusations, the Western commentators see low attendance as Africa's reaction to Russia's pullover from the Black Sea grain deal and the prevalent Ukraine war crisis caused by Russia. The Western media insinuated that Putin was the cause of grain shortage and high fuel prices afflicting Africa's economies. However, Russia has stressed that nothing could be further from the truth, as these negative outcomes are the result of volatile geopolitics of which US and West have important role to play. Ukraine is one of the largest exporter of grains and wheat to the world, especially the Africa. The Black Sea grain deal ensured safe export of Ukrainian grain to the rest of the world through safe passage of ships from the Black Sea. Russia's pullover from the deal has again sparked fears over global food supplies, particularly in parts of Africa such as the food-scarce areas of the Horn of Africa, which were reliant on food imports from Russia and Ukraine. The shortage of grains has worsened food insecurity in the continent and shot up food prices, according to the African Development Bank. Some African leaders, including that of Kenya, have been critical over Russia's aggression and war with Ukraine. Some African nations even opposed Russia's invasion in the UN vote. However, Eritrea was the only African nation to support Russia's invasion in the UN vote. However, Africa's stand on the Russia-Ukraine war has largely been neutral amid Western pressure to condemn Moscow. It is also important to observe that the African continent has no permanent voice at the United Nations Security Council, which leaves it vulnerable to the West's divide-and-rule tactics. Africa hopes to look towards Russia and the East for their voices to be heard at global stage. Another important observation of the summit was the attendance of the Wagner's founder-in-chief. Prigozhin was spotted on the sidelines of the summit. This was his first sighting inside Russia since he led an armed rebellion against the country's military in June 2023. It is believed that Russia's Wagner mercenaries have also been deployed in some African states by Russia to counter economic sanctions and isolation. The leaders of Mali and the Central African Republic, whose governments have relied heavily on the services of Russia's Wagner Group, both expressed gratitude to Putin. They termed Russia's support critical in avoiding civil war and imposition of foreign hegemony. Even the African leaders that did not attend the summit have been known to be critical of Western socio-economic policies that have wrecked Africa over the past decades. Kenyan President William Ruto has recently lambasted the West for being a big player in Africa's woes, ranging from economic repression to climate change. He also criticized the West for roping the world in certain conflicts but turned a blind eye when it comes to Africa's problems. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has also been vocal on the socio-economic inequalities between the global North and the global South. He has also criticized West for fanning Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, aims to utilize support of the African leaders attending the summit to promote a multipolar world order and fight what he refers to the Western neocolonialism. He has offered debt write-offs and grain to woo allies in the African continent. Putin's meeting with African leaders has set the stage for the forthcoming BRICS summit to be held in August 2023 in Johannesburg, South Africa. The summit is expected to cover trade and investment facilitation, sustainable development, innovation, and global governance reform, which are also some of the issues that concern Russia and Africa alike. African states have been showing interest to join BRICS and cooperate with China and Russia to develop regional connectivity and economic ties. Conversation around the formation of a BRICS currency in order to avoid over-reliance on the dollar is seen as an important development that may shape future balance of power. This will be an important development because Africa is home to 18% of the world population, which mostly comprises of young workforce. Africa is set to contribute to a GDP size of $4 trillion by 2027. Russian leader promised free grain to 6 African nations and assured them assistance to mitigate food inflation. Moscow extended its support to avert a global food crisis nearly a week after withdrawing from Black Sea grain deal, which allowed Ukraine, one of the world's largest grain producers, to export its farm products across the Black Sea. As a result, grain export to African nations was terminated, causing food crisis. Russian president defended its actions as its determination to counter neocolonialism, the practice of applying illegitimate sanctions and attempts to undermine traditional moral values of Russia. The joint declaration of the summit called for the establishment of a more just, balanced, and stable multipolar world order, firmly opposing all types of international confrontation in the African continent. Russia wants to gain more allies on the African soil to avoid effects of Western sanctions and isolation. Russia plans on building plants and factories and increasing diplomatic missions on the continent. Many of the leaders praised Moscow's support for their countries in their 20th century liberation struggles, and the final declaration promised Russia would help them seek compensation for the damage done by colonial rule. African leaders pressed Putin to move ahead with their peace plan to end the Ukraine conflict. Similarly, African leaders stressed on joint efforts for ending disruptions of energy and grain supplies, because it aggravates world food crisis and energy shortages. Leaders from Egypt, Congo, and South Africa, among others, stressed Russia to consider peace deal over Ukraine conflict and move towards normalization, and expected the West to join as well. However, Putin has remained adamant on his policy approach and blamed the US and its allies for the escalation and conflict in Ukraine. He also blamed Western sanctions and monopoly for economic disparity and food crisis in the African continent. It is yet to be seen whether Russia would be able to strengthen its relations and gather allies in Africa. However, it is certain that with the prevailing Ukraine war crisis and its economic fallout, the developing countries, especially in Africa, are reluctant to take sides and are advocating peace agreement to end the crisis. This is also significant due to fear of Western-backed sanctions and legal backlash from international courts and the United Nations. However, the African states have options to look for in the multipolar world to reduce the disparity and economic stress between the global North and South. Africa is seeing its potential and moving towards economic cooperation with the East to bring about development to its people from the long-lasting conflicts and effects of colonialism.